Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poetry and Talk. Poetry and Talk is a new online informational poetry gathering for poets to share their poetry, background, and inspiration. We're so grateful that you've tuned in with us. We have a great lineup of poets for you for the next couple of months, moving into early 2021. So we hope you'll stick around with us. We have a new guest poet to introduce to you today. I'm Leslie Sue, the host for Poetry and Talk. You can stay connected with us in social media on our Facebook page under the same name, Poetry and Talk. Please like and share and be on the lookout for new poet interviews. I'd like to welcome our guest poet, Prajakta. Welcome.
Thank you, Leslie. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Great to have you. On Poetry and Talk, we like to have our guest poet give a brief introduction to a poem that they've written and then read it to us. And it helps us get some insight into their poetic style and help set the tone for the show. Welcome again, everyone. Welcome, Prajakta.
Thank you. So thank you everyone who's tuned in and listening to Leslie and I talk about poetry today. I'm going to read a poem that's from my book, Fragrance. And the reason I'm going to read this poem is because it has been my first real poem. So I started writing poems when I was only 13 years of age. And this was one of the first real poems I wrote as a teenager. So bear that in mind when you interpret it. The poem is called Candles of God. So the poem is Candles of God. Hundreds of God's candles I see when I look up at the sky tonight. Their beautiful flames in the world spread His divine light. Throughout the night, in the sky they are twinkling. They light up nature while the sun is sleeping. Sometimes a candle falls off His hand. We see it, and to Him we pray. We wish for something big or small. He grants this wish, they say. When the sun comes up to say, good morning, He blows off His candles till the next evening.
Beautiful. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Elaborate on that, if you would, please.
Sorry, Leslie, I couldn't catch that.
Yes, if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Absolutely, I would love to. So this poem was written through the eyes of a 13, 14-year-old who was just looking at the sky. I love looking at the sky. Astronomy and the planets and the universe have always been topics of interest ever since I was a child. So I often in the evenings used to just stare up at the sky and daydream away. And shooting stars was a phenomenon that really captured my young imagination at that time. And this poem was actually not written in one place. It was during a train journey. It was an evening train journey. And I was going from Mumbai to Jaipur in the western part of India, which is where I grew up. It was a long train journey. There was nothing to do and just an evening sky full of stars. And the poem just came to me. And that was the marvelous thing about poems for me, that when they came almost in their entirety. All the words just flowed. So that's the background of this poem. It was on a train journey when I was about 14 years of age.
Wow. And it just spontaneously came to you.
It spontaneously came to me. I believe what might have happened is that over the years, looking at the sky and the stars just allowed some ideas or some feelings to keep simmering inside. And that was the moment when they just all came together.
Mm-hmm. Now, had you written poetry before this poem?
I had written a few poems before this one, but maybe just a couple. And that too, they were not in English. They were actually in Hindi. Mm-hmm. So it was an interesting phase in my life when I wrote this poem. I was almost at a point where I believed that, I could write long essays because we used to write those in school. But I used to believe that I would never be able to compose a poem. They were just way too complex and beautiful for them to come through me. So I had that limiting belief. And then one day something just had to touch my heart, and then it started, and then it didn't stop.
Hmm. That's a really deep topic, and deep observations, and deep reflection to put into a poetic structure at such a young age.
That's right. I am surprised myself.
Okay, so let's go ahead. Continuing on with your poetic journey, share with us some of the things.
So it's interesting how my poetic journey began. As I shared, I went from believing I could never write a poem to writing a set of a dozen poems when I felt inspired. And then it was really my father who encouraged me to keep writing. He said that he gave me almost a target. He said, when you finish 50 poems, I'm going to publish a book for you. And for me at that age, being a published author was like, oh my God, it was the thing. It would be like, I have achieved something in life, right? So that really got me going. And I feel that even for artistic pursuits like poetry, which are so inspiration based, it's useful to have a father figure or anyone in your environment sort of put you to task, because it's so easy to fall off track in creative pursuits. So I really have to credit my dad for giving me that target. And I wrote those 50 poems, and we had them edited, and we had somebody typeset them and design a cover, think of the name. My grandfather and my dad really took it to heart to bring this project to life. So when I was about 17, 18 years of age, we published this book that I showed you earlier. It's a collection of my very first poems, and many of them are now, I feel, are so different from who I have become today. But that is really the beginning of my journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I continued to write after that just for pleasure. I realized after writing those 50 poems that, hey, just publishing a book is not the goal. The process of writing a poem is the end goal in itself. So I began to really enjoy the process of coming up with a poem, putting it down on paper, moving the words around, and bringing it to a stage where it was really saying what I felt. And I almost became addicted to that poetic process. So that got me writing. When I went to college, enjoying this process, naturally I took a course in creative writing, of particularly of poetry, because it seemed like a natural step. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to me right now are either considering doing something like that or are already enrolled in a course. But here's a point of caution from my experience. That course actually put me into a writer's block, because for the first time I encountered rules on poetry, rules on writing poetry. And in hindsight, I had a great teacher. He really brought things out of me, but it was just the structure that was being put on how a poem is written, how it's recited, the meter, the rhythm. All of this was probably too early in my journey at that point in time. So my little nugget of wisdom from that experience was that it's good to go into a training or a guided course on creative writing after you've created a body of your work, after you've brought enough out of yourself and your voice, and then to use that course to look back on your work rather than use that course to create a body of work.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a little nugget of wisdom that I took away. But that writer's block lasted for a few years. And it was only recently when I think it was only after I moved to Canada, which was about 7, 8 years back, that I got back into poetry again. Seriously, I kept writing. I kept writing for academic purposes. I kept writing even reflective prose pieces. But poetry just seemed to have hidden in some corner of my heart for all those years. And then when I moved back here, I had a lot of different life events occur. And maybe that's what touched my heart again. And I began writing again. And since then, I've been writing. I've been writing on a blog. I've been writing just simply as a gift to somebody. And I've tried my best to keep that flame alive.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are.
Mm-hmm. Talk to us about the creative process.
Sure.
How was it for you? If you can get into detail about it and elaborate on this whole kind of infinite, vast world of creativity, how does it play out for you?
Sure. So, given my personality, and as you must have figured out from the poem I read as well, that I'm very inspired by nature and phenomenon in nature. And I'm a very observant person. So even the littlest of changes around me, I'm sensitive to. And that sensitivity is something I've learned over time is not something to shut down. It's something to really hold on to. And many a times I realize that the littlest thing that I'm sensitive to eventually becomes a poem. And what happens in between these two ends of the process is that I just let it sit. Most of my creative process is not active. It's a subconscious process where I don't shut down a thought. I let it sit for a few days. And then once again, when I'm sitting, I usually write in the morning. So when I'm sitting in quietness, usually with a cup of coffee, a couple of lines just come to mind, or sometimes even not a couple of lines, just a couple of phrases, really, really bare bone phrases. And I realized that, oh, this is connected to that experience I had 2 weeks ago. But when I get those phrases, I make sure to write them down. And then I go into this conscious process of trying to develop them. So sometimes the first draft of sometimes it's just 4 lines or 6 lines that I write, I make myself write about those phrases that came to my mind is just terrible. I feel like just crumpling that paper and putting it away. And I do that sometimes if I'm too frustrated, I would do that. But then I make sure to bring it out again, because all it requires is moving things around until they say what I feel.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be a takeaway for a new writer perhaps, is that don't ever delete or throw away anything you've ever written. Sometimes the worst thing you've written can just fit in like a jigsaw puzzle in another project. So that's something I've started doing. And then once I work, coming back to the process, once I work on those 4 or 6 lines, which were so terrible in the beginning, given enough time, I just am able to pull up the right vocab for certain parts of it, for certain feelings. And then it falls together enough for me to say that, okay, this is a poem. Maybe I should share it either with a writing group or on my blog for feedback. And I take it on from there.
Mm-hmm.
That's my process. It's
Mm-hmm.
a very it's not a romantic process at all. It goes from terrible writing to okay writing.
Well, I see a lot of parallels in nature, which you mentioned is an influence with you. So it's sort of like you get the idea, you get some inspiration, you get a couple of ideas, and you let it germinate. It's almost like it's getting planted into the ground,
That's right.
back off, and you just kind of let it simmer, let it grow, let the sun, let the water get to it. And then at the right moment, you get the inspiration and you're like, okay, now is the moment where you're going to kind of get into like the nuts and bolts of it.
That's perfect. Leslie, I couldn't have put it so well as you did.
When that inspiration hits, how do you know? Like you just get a feeling? Is there like a little reminder about the poem, a couple words enter your awareness? How do you know, okay, now it's germinated, it needs to come up above the ground and we're going to write it? How do you know when that moment is?
That's an interesting question, Leslie. And I think this has been a revelation for me too. And I wasn't so sensitive to inspiration in the beginning. I've become more sensitive over the years. And what really surprises me is that inspiration is a physical feeling. I feel different in my body when I'm getting an inspiring thought. It may just be tingles in my around my spine, or sometimes I just become very alert to everything around me. And I've over the years, it's been a process. Over the years, I've become more attuned to realizing when that happens. And then I try if I can to drop anything else I'm doing and to just be in that moment and write down that inspiration at that very point in time before it leaves me. So I'd say that it's a very physical feeling for me, and I've learned to recognize it.
Mm-hmm. And do you, when you jot these things down, do you do like pen and paper and computer, or do you have a favorite one?
I am a pen and paper person still. And I do put it on my blog because I think there's benefit to having it online and in soft copy. It's so much more easier to manage and edit and move around. But my first drafts are always pen and paper. It's just a little pocket notebook and pen that I keep wherever I am.
Mhm. And in terms of subject matter, can you share with us, is the poem that you read reflective of the subject matter that you write a lot on?
Um,
Part of it, what kind of things do you enjoy writing about in your poetry?
Sure, I'd love to speak about that and probably figure it out myself as well as I speak about it. Because, okay, in the beginning, it all began with nature. But I think that was more to do with the fact that at the age of 13, we haven't seen much in life anyway. But over time, as I sort of accumulated more life experience, had the opportunity to be in a lot more interpersonal situations, my poems tended to focus on relationships and all sorts of relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships, friendships. Um, and as I went through life, when life took a different flavor, I realized that that became reflected in my poetry. So I'd give you an example. A few years back, I had the opportunity to live in Africa for 2 years in East Africa, and it was one of the most enriching and mind broadening experiences I've had so far. And a lot of my poems, not at that time, but later on, tended to reflect upon my time there and what I saw there, coming across poverty for the first time and still getting baffled that the poorest people I meet are also some of the happiest I've seen. So I've written a poem about that. So different aspects of my life found expression in my poetry, and that is one of the reasons why I struggle to categorize my poems under one or two themes. And I've let it be that way.
Mhm. In terms of structure, do you like to have it a little more free flowing? Do you like to tell a story, paint a picture, or something completely different? What is that kind of structure within your poems, please?
I'd say that in the beginning, I focused a lot on structure and I tried to make them rhythmic because I had only ever read and enjoyed poems that were rhythmic. But over time, I have migrated more to a style that is free flow, almost sometimes like prose. So it's prose poetry and longer as well. There is always a story in my poems, and I see that happening more and more often now. Maybe I've just become a slightly better storyteller with practice. There's always a story. Sometimes even the poems which sound autobiographical are not. I'm imagining two different people, even if I'm using the first person to describe the feelings of at least one of them. So the structure has kind of become more fuzzy over time.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, we still have a few more moments here. Prajakta, what else would you like to share with us that we haven't currently gotten into?
Sure, I would. I think I wouldn't want to share too much in terms of advice for anybody because I think poetry is not something that works with advice. It's more about knowing ourselves inside, and the more we know ourselves inside, the better our poems become outwardly, or at least that has been my experience. One other thing that I've experienced through poetry is because I write poems in three languages, more so in English, but I also write in Hindi and Marathi, which are my mother tongues. I've also experimented a little bit with Urdu poetry. Urdu is a dialect of Hindi and Persian that's spoken in the northwest part of India. So I've experimented with that. But one thing I've realized is that the more I express in my mother tongue, the better my expressiveness becomes across all the languages. Maybe simply because my mother tongue speaks so much to my heart. So I'd say that anybody who's writing poetry or is going to experiment with poetry should really go out and seek out experiences that touch their heart. and then the poetry would naturally come. That's been my experience.
Mhm. I'd like to ask you also, Prajakta, if you could share with us, when you complete a poem and you've gone through this whole process and you now have it complete, what does that feel like? Like, for example, do you have a sense of completion? Do you feel like, okay, that's great, now I'm on to the next project? Do you feel that, I don't, anything related to it? Because sometimes when we complete a poem or anything related to the arts, it's, it's some different things that we kind of feel about it. So share with us how that is for you.
Sure, that's such a good question, Leslie. I've never really thought about it thoroughly, but now that you ask me that, once again, it's a very physical feeling. And I'll tell you what it feels like. It feels like I've had a tall cup of coffee. I feel alive in every single part of my body. And this is true whether I've written a happy poem or a sad one. It doesn't matter. It just feels like there was something sitting inside of me, and now I've expressed it through every single cell of my body. That's my experience after having completed it.
Mhm. That is really beautiful. You're giving me tingles. Thank you. So it's a very physiological thing for you.
It's totally physiological.
Right. That's kind of how you're getting your guidance and kind of pacing you and letting you know the next steps and whatnot.
Absolutely.
All right, we're going to need to wrap things up for today. We're so grateful for everyone who's been watching. I'd just like to mention, if you're watching and you're a poet and you haven't connected with us and you're interested in being interviewed with us, you can reach us at poetryandtalk@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you with scheduling and information for a poet interview. We'd like to have some closing comments for you, if you would, Prajakta, and please let us know where we can find you.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful to you, Leslie, and to everyone who's tuned in. I'm grateful because this has been an opportunity for me to share my poetic journey, as well as I hope that there will be something from here that would be a takeaway for every single person who's tuned in. I'd love to connect with each of you individually. I'm on Medium, and you can find me on Medium at Prajakta. I'm sure Leslie will share these details later on as well. But it is such a beautiful thing to connect with other poets or other poetry enthusiasts. So thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate your time. Thank you for being our guest poet. That was a wonderful interview. Thank you. Thank you
Thank you,
again
Leslie.
for watching. Please stay tuned with us. Again, you can check us out on Facebook, on our Facebook page, Poetry and Talk. We'll see you the next time on Poetry and Talk with a new poet interview. Until then, be well, be blessed. Thank you.